Secondly, of course, we know that the economic volatility, and particularly during periods of crisis, also contribute to the war danger and the drive to war. And this is because, first of all, the depth of the crisis intensifies the struggle between different imperialist powers, increases the contradictions between those imperialist centers. You know that there was those who speculated, especially in the 70s and 80s, that inter-imperialist crisis didn't exist anymore. Well, they were subordinated. They were pushed below the surface as part of the general struggle against socialism on a world scale. But those contradictions were always there, and they surfaced after 1990 again. And I would argue that the current crisis is further accelerating or intensifying this rivalry between the imperialist states. And it's reflected in things like growing protectionism. But we know as well that it's precisely during such cataclysmic crises in the system which can lead to war. And certainly we know the rise of fascism in Europe and Asia in the 30s was ultimately resolved by a world war. Another aspect of or role of war in terms of helping to resolve the crises of capitalism, not in the benefit of working people, but in the benefit of maintaining the system of capitalism, is its role in destroying excess capacity. You know, there's been lots of studies and articles done about the fact that just even on the eve of this crisis, over the past 12 to 15 months, that levels of capacity, that the utilization of industrial and productive capacity in the global economy was at its lowest level in many, many decades. That is to say that there were many more factories and capacities to produce wealth than were actually producing it. Why? Because there weren't markets. People didn't have the money to purchase these goods and whatnot. So how do ruling circles extricate themselves from crises? Well, part of it is to destroy that excess capacity, to reprime the pump. And war is one of the most effective, and I know this sounds, I'm being facetious here by saying it's effective, but in a certain sense, from the point of view of the ruling circles, it is effective in destroying that excess capacity. You level an entire city and all of its factories and all of its workshops and so on and so forth, and in one fell swoop, you've destroyed an awful lot of that excess capacity. Of course, in the process, you're killing people, you're destroying cultures, you're wreaking environmental damage, and you're threatening, in fact, the very existence of humanity in the process. This is the so-called collateral damage. But from a narrow economic point of view, war is effective in helping the capitalists to then start the process again of expansion, like we saw in the post-war period in Europe, in particular, and other parts of the world. Now there are those, and I'm about to wrap up here, there are those who will suggest, again, not from a peace point of view, but from the point of view of those who control politically and economically our society, to suggest that war, in a way, is a way to help us get out of the crisis. There's a very interesting article I was reading over coffee this morning in today's Globe and Mail. And it's on page 8, and those of you who have picked up the Saturday Star, did I say Globe and Mail? The Star. An article by James Travers. He makes a very interesting point. And although he's not a Marxist or a left-winger, he nonetheless makes a very interesting observation in his column. He says that amongst the many things that happened in Canada this week, because we found it, for those of you who aren't from Canada, you may not know, but there's been all sorts of things going on in Parliament, the possibility of an election, and so on and so forth, and a lot of focus on that. He said one of the things that's been missed in all of this coverage this week is the fact that the Defense Minister of Canada, Peter MacKay, came out for the first time to openly suggest that the deadline for Canada to get out of Afghanistan, which has been set as July of 2011, may now be pushed back, and that the Canadian combat mission may continue beyond that. And he further speculates that in the meetings that took place between Harper and Obama and the US administration over the past few weeks have focused on the question of Afghanistan in this respect. The Canadian government, on behalf of Canadian big business, because Canada exports a lot to the US market, is very concerned about the Buy America clauses in the TARP and the stimulus packages in the US. Very concerned about that because it means that Canadian companies are losing out on those contracts. And that's billions upon billions of dollars in the US economy. And he speculates in this article, I don't know if it's accurate or true or not, but I think that he's getting at something, that in the private negotiations between Harper and the US administration, which by the way has been open about wanting Canada and other NATO countries to stay in Afghanistan and not to withdraw, that they did some private horse trading on this question. And that the US administration would press harder with states and municipalities in the US to exclude Canada from this exclusion of the Buy America thing, in return for what? For Canada to stay in Afghanistan even longer. And the implication of all of this is that this would be good for the Canadian economy. Why? Because it would create jobs, because it would be more exports to the US, and the only price we'd have to pay is a continuing involvement in Afghanistan. But this is just one example of a broader mentality that makes the case for war and militarization and arms spending be a way to solve this economic crisis. Well, we know, in fact, that it's quite the opposite. That, in fact, it further deepens and exacerbates not only the hardships and the suffering of peoples around the world, especially those who are directly victimized by war and expansion and plunder, but also working people in our countries themselves, because of all of the profligate waste involved in arms spending and resources that could go into healthcare, childcare, and services for people, housing, etc., etc., etc. And that, I think, that kind of understanding is precisely what, particularly in this circumstance of this deepening global crisis, that we can contribute to the broader peace movement. I think it would be wrong for us to make that as a precondition for unity with broader peace forces. We know that people come into the peace movement for all sorts of different reasons. Some of them are spiritual and religious. Some of them are just the instinct to survive and wanting to prevent war and plunder. But it is a unique contribution that our most advanced section of the peace movement can make to the broader struggle for peace, to make it more effective, to make it more conscious and purposeful. Thank you.